I did want to come back to a couple of issues that I think will be useful to explore a little more, and then we have some questions from the teachers, and teachers keep putting your questions in the chat. We'll get to them. But Rob, tell us more about FDR on this, right? I mean, we talk a lot today about problems of leaders and politicians lying, but FDR in certain ways was not entirely truthful, right? I think we should talk about that. And what was FDR trying to do in the late 30s and early 1940s? Can you sort of paint that picture for us?
Yeah, good question. Hitler and FDR come to power at virtually the same moment. In early 1933, in other words, of course, FDR is elected by a democratic process. Hitler is appointed by a kind of backstairs cabal of conservative politicians who thought that they could use Hitler to kind of restore the old German monarchy. But they come to power at the same time, and it's always been interesting to me. The Depression was Hitler's excuse for doing everything, for rearming and for putting millions of men back into uniform, and it was an emergency. And so we can't be merciful toward our domestic enemies. We can't have people backbiting at home. We can't have disagreements. We got to put our political enemies in concentration camps and on and on and on. Everything, all those horrible things Hitler did. But Roosevelt had the same depression, and he looked at it as primarily a social and economic problem. But I've always thought that FDR's greatest moment came, in that first inaugural, Jeremy, when he said, our problem isn't the banks. It's not the numbers of unemployed people. It's not the economy, which is this thing that no one even understands. I mean, I'll be the first to admit it. I have some stocks, and it's a complete mystery to me what happens to them from day to day. But there's Roosevelt, who said, you know what your real problem is, and this is why he speaks to me to the present day. Your real problem is fear. You know what you should really be afraid of? Fear. Why? Because fear closes you off. It makes you lock your door against your neighbors. It makes you unwilling to help. It makes you look out for number one. We brag about that. I look out for number one. Roosevelt was saying, it's not really, we can't look out for number one. In some ways, we have to look out for one another. When COVID struck, whatever it was now, we're in the 11th, about 8 months ago, March of 2020. I was suddenly on TV all the time, on the Today Show and then all the big media, and they were all asking the same question. Does World War II have anything to tell us about the present day? And I said, well, it doesn't have anything really to tell us about epidemiology or virology. Those are very complicated subjects, but it does have something to tell us about the American people and what the American people need to do in times of crisis is band together, is work together. I understand the issue. This is a tough one. I said, because we're being told to kind of lock your doors against your neighbors, at least not to get too close to them. So it seems to me that that's just something I want to say why I think FDR is the greatest president. He took office in a fearful time, and he told the American people, look, the big thing is we got a lot of talent. We have a lot of untapped wealth in this country. We have a lot of potential, and there's nothing we can't achieve as long as we don't give in to our fears. But he harked back. He's a Democrat. He harked back to the greatest Republican of them all, Lincoln, who said, we have to trust the better angels of our nature, not the worst angels of our nature. Sometimes I get mad, I just want to grab a rocket launcher. Everybody does, the state of the world. It seems horrible, but you really have to trust. And I think that's a great sort of American trait, is to trust. So Roosevelt, that's a long way of answering your question, Jeremy. Roosevelt looked around at an international situation which was deteriorating, in which democracy after democracy was falling by the wayside, and dictatorships were coming to the fore everywhere. Whatever international law existed at the time had turned into a mockery. The Japanese invaded Manchuria in 1931. The League of Nations said, don't do that. The Japanese walked out of the League of Nations like, who cares what the world thinks? Hitler came to power. One of the first things he did was take Nazi Germany out of the League of Nations, because he said it's a plot. It's a British-French plot to keep Germany down. And he got applauded for that. And so Roosevelt, I think, is trying to do what he can to prop up the international order, one based on liberal principles of legality and justice, and if there's a problem, of negotiation. But he's got an issue that if he gets too involved in the foreign political side, he's got the American people to deal with. And you could look at the polls, and isolationism was still a fact of American life right to the right to the eve of World War II. So there are limits to what he can do. Let me give an example. In the 1940 election, but let me take a sip first. In the 1940 election, Roosevelt famously told the American people, your sons are not going to go off to fight any foreign wars. And he had to know that there was a chance that wasn't going to be true. Well, Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, which at the time was an American possession, so technically it wasn't a foreign war. But of course, American boys and American girls, or men and women, both are in uniform in World War II, fought all over the world. I mean, a World War II is the quintessential notion of a foreign war. You could say technically not, but so politicians, they have to shave. It's a foreign policy, especially. If you want certitude, go into chemistry. Go into one of the hard sciences. But if you need certitude, you can't go into foreign policy, because the first thing you're going to have a choice between terrible and really terrible, and that's going to be the maneuver space that you have, the maneuver room that you have between options. Sure. I'm an FDR fan. We have a beautiful statue of him seated on a bench in our parade ground here in the museum, and I walk home from work every day. And I say, see you tomorrow, Mr. President. I don't know if anyone hears me. I'm going to be committed one of these days, but I'm an FDR.
I think the point you're making is an important one, which is that the country was deeply isolationist, and Roosevelt was doing what he could to pull the country and prepare the country for a war that he saw coming, certainly as soon as 38, 39. And
if I could, I'll throw in one with real crucial data, I think, the fall of France. It's a real shocker. France is a great military power, and the Germans run through it within weeks, and no one expected this.
Right.
Now the Americans realize how horribly unprepared the country is. And Roosevelt, this is June of 1940. Roosevelt calls in some industrialists, Big Bill Knudsen from General Motors, president of General Motors, and some others. And he says, we got to get started. How long will it take to convert the American economy to wartime? He asked this in June of 1940. And Knudsen, has a little pad of paper and a pencil, that was the computer of the day, whatever, jots down some figures and says, Mr. President, 18 months. Right. Should be ready by December of 1941. You can't make that up. You can't make that up. So of course, that's when war came. Some people hear that story and say, oh, conspiracy theory. It's not a conspiracy theory. It's just the truth that it would take 18 months, and America was much better prepared at the time of Pearl Harbor than it would have been 18 months previously. That's the point.
So Rob, one more question, then we get to the teachers' questions, but I think it's important to bring out. You spend a lot of time at the World War II Museum with oral histories, which are so powerful in bringing to life the experience of ordinary American men and women during the war. What was it that brought all Americans together? I mean, for our students today, it's hard to imagine a time when people aren't yelling at each other and they all agree that we have to work together against a foreign foe. We were a partisan society. Roosevelt had strong detractors, Father Coughlin on the radio, Huey Long, right? So it's not as if people were not partisan, but yet they did come together. How do we explain that to our students?
Great question. It's a great question. Well, I think the best answer I can give is a two-word answer, and it's Pearl Harbor. Look, we didn't get into World War II because the president went on the radio and said, I think it's time to go to war with the Japanese. I don't like what they're doing in China. I don't like what they have designs on the Dutch East Indies. Most Americans couldn't find it on a map. As today, probably most Americans can't find Indonesia on a map. I wouldn't be surprised. So it's not a presidential fiat, that says, hey, it's time to go to war. That would have been a tough sell, man. But instead, Roosevelt could come on the radio the day, December 8th, 1941, and say, there's been this dastardly attack on the United States. 2,000 plus American sailors have been killed. The Hawaiian Islands have been attacked. It was a Sunday morning, for heaven's sake. And what that means to most Americans, it was a much more religious society, much higher degrees of church going amongst the Christian population in America in the 1940s than exists today. Because I heard that constantly. When I was a kid, the big thing that happened about Pearl Harbor, it was on Sunday morning, like the worst thing you could say. Right, so Roosevelt was able to do that. He wrote out a speech, he had a speech kind of typed out for me, he had some ideas, and then he did his own editing. Roosevelt's fantastic. And it's a day which will live in history, the original quote. And Roosevelt erased or scratched out history and said, this is a day that will live in infamy. He told the American people they'd been the victim of a crime, an international crime. And it was going to be very, very difficult to go against that. You know, the decision, the vote in the House was nearly unanimous. I say nearly, I believe there was one dissenting vote, and it's Helen Rankin, Congresswoman from Montana, if I'm not mistaken. She had voted against our participation in World War I. Should give this woman a medal. You know, we say our politicians change their mind all the time, but she really didn't. So that to me, Jeremy, and that let me just expand on maybe 30 seconds more. That's why the Japanese strategies failed. The Japanese said, look, we'll conquer this big Pacific empire, fortify all the islands. No American president would be able to order, you know, American soldiers to conquer island after island, taking 10,000 casualties a pop. The Pacific is the biggest ocean in the world. The American people will never stand for it. The young American boys lack the guts to do it. Now, all those things are specious on their face. I don't think we even need to argue with that, but any hope that that was true went out the window 10 seconds after the first press release came, you know, over your radio about Pearl Harbor.
Right.
You know, so it just showed the Japanese leadership was not, they were not rowing with both oars in the water on this one. I don't think they really thought it through. The impact a surprise attack would have on the American people, even if 100% of the Americans were isolationists. A lot fewer of them would be isolationists after Pearl Harbor.
In a way, it certainly echoes 9/11 in a certain way. So we have a bunch of teacher questions. We only have a few minutes. Sam is reminding me that we only have a few minutes. So I just want to get through a couple of these. And so Edward Hagen asks, how did the Germans and Japanese finance their military buildup prior to
that's a good point. In both cases, there were huge gaps in the kind of military buildup they could carry out, but for precisely that reason. But essentially, you had, in both cases, command economies. The free market is sort of disrupted for a moment. You have big industries lying fallow because there were, in both Germany and Japan in the late 20s and early 30s because of the Depression, you had huge levels of unemployment. So you can put people back to work with various kinds of make work and public works projects. Think WPA in the United States. Roosevelt is doing that in the US at the same time. Hitler has various kinds of programs called the Arbeitsdienst, which is the labor service. What are they doing? They're building roads, they're draining swamps, they're cutting down forests and reclaiming farmland. Exact same sorts of things that the CCC was doing in the United States at the time. So you put people back to work, but you also just lay out huge sums of a capital that had been lying fallow in times of high unemployment. Now, the real problem is that when your economy is working at 24/7, 365 to produce weapons, at some point, you're going to have to slow it down. You're going to have to retool. And the Germans made a big deal about the fact that Hitler had conquered the unemployment problem. But by 1938, 1939, it was clear that a lot of German armaments industries were going to have to retool, and that was going to mean temporary unemployment for a time.
Right.
So I think if you look at Hitler launching a war in 1939, there's all kinds of reasons for it, but I think one of them is the economic side. But it's the command economy, and to me, the command economy is always great for about 8 years. Right now, today's Chinese are kind of beating the odds on the command economy, but you know, let's just see what happens when all is said and done on that score.
Great answer. That's super helpful. A couple of teachers, Rob, have asked, this includes Teresa Russo and Sue Ellen Houston, about how the Japanese obtain their oil after the embargo. This is a really important point, right?
Yeah, it is an important one. There are some oil supplies in Manchuria, the territory in northeastern China they had conquered, and some in mainland China, some offshore. So they're eking out, but essentially they're living off of their, they're living off of their stockpiles. Now, there is one exception, and this, again, will call into question the entire Japanese decision to go to war. So I'm sorry for that, but there's so many questions that are, the Japanese were still buying oil from the Dutch. We embargoed our oil, but we can't tell the Dutch what to do, and they weren't embargoing their oil. They made a play of it. They cut down some supplies, but they were still selling Japan oil at really favorable rates because they were terrified of an invasion of the Dutch East Indies by the Japanese. And then the Japanese go to war, and eventually our submarines are going to sink every last Japanese tanker. And they can't get a drop of oil out of the Dutch East Indies. But they were doing fine before they launched a war to seize it.
I did not know that. That's really interesting. I didn't
There's
know.
there's a huge body of literature. It's a little dated now. I'd have to check it out, which talked about the role that Royal Dutch Shell, the big company, this big multinational corporation, played in the oncoming war in the Pacific. So it's interesting, and it's a little bit technical about oil fields and production quotas and capacities and that sort of thing. But the Japanese, they could have had all the oil they needed. They could have bought it from the Dutch.
So one last question before we go to our discussion of the documents, and there's still a few other questions we didn't get to. I apologize, but hopefully through Google Classroom we can get those answered as well. This one,
I know how to react to something. So if you didn't get your question, you feel free and email me. I'll do my best to give you an answer.
Great. So Christina Longofono asks really a crucial question. Did the Soviets do more of the work than the Americans to contain the Nazis?
Wow.
How do we, because we tend to tell the story from the American side. But, was Stalin right? Did the Soviets really win the war in Europe?
I believe that the Soviet Union by itself could have beaten the Germans. I don't believe they could have done it by 1945. The war would have gone on into 1946 and 1947. By which point, maybe the Germans would have invented the atom bomb. Once you stretch out the war a couple more years, almost anything can happen. You leave the historical timeline. But look, let's not put it that way. Let's just say this: at any given time in the war in Europe, 75 to 80% of the German Wehrmacht, the German armed forces, were deployed in the East against the Soviet Union. The West European front's so much smaller. It's not denigrating to the Western powers to say that. The Eastern front is a lot bigger. If you're going to man it, you have to have 80% of your army out there. And that means that 80% of the casualties the Germans suffered in World War II were inflicted by the Red Army. Now, where the West came in, we landed big armies in 1944, and we pressed in on Germany from the West and overran Western Europe. Definitely played a major role, but we also did something else, and that's our navies controlled the 7 seas of the world against the Axis, and thus allowed for the Allies to ship men and materiel. I mean, we actually flew our president out to Tehran, Iran, in the middle of the war. Shows you who controlled the airspace, and that was largely, that control of airspace, that was largely a Western Allied contribution. But I'll end with this: who crushed the German economy, and it was largely crushed from the skies. And of course, that's the Royal Air Force and the U.S. Army Air Forces. So, look, there's glory enough to go around. In the Cold War, where I grew up, and I was born in 1958, in the 60s and 70s, it was tough to say something like that about the Soviets. It was the height of the Cold War, and what are you, defending the communists? Is the kind of thing that you would get. But the Cold War is over, and it's been over for a long time. And what we owe everyone right now, Voltaire once said, you should be polite to the living, but to the dead, you owe only the truth. And I think that it's high time that we were able to recognize the fact that this was a war in the East between two of the most horrific dictatorships of all time: Stalin's Russia and Hitler's Germany. And Stalin's Russia won it. He was our ally at the time. That's why we should never get it was a battle of good versus evil. Yes, in some ways it was, but we also were in bed with some pretty rough character, and especially in the form of Joseph Stalin.
Fantastic. Rob, this has been great.